what a good workout.
Yeah, Mark, me too.
I love coming to the gym.
Yeah, I am pumped.
Oh!
Well, after a great workout right there, I'm just ready for the day. Are you ready to go face all those wimpy people out in the world?
Oh, I am so ready. But to get myself some focus, I like to look in the mirror and sing some songs to myself. Songs like, I'm too sexy for this shirt. Too sexy for this shirt. So sexy, it hurts.
Oh, good
Yeah.
one. Maybe we can do one together.
Yeah, let's do another one together. We are the champions, my friends.
Oh, and we'll
Keep on fighting to the end.
Dun, 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 dun. This is a good idea to psych yourself up. I think I have a song we could do too. I'm so pretty, oh so pretty, I'm so pretty. Again, I don't know why you encourage us on those things, but hey, welcome again today. Welcome to those online as well. We are in week 3 of our series, Weak or Wise, and we're looking all at wisdom this month, how we can make wise choices to make the most of this new year. And so we've been looking at some different things, and today we're going to be talking about humility, and obviously that video was the opposite of that. That was kind of two guys in the gym that think maybe too highly of themselves, and think they're too sexy, think they're champions, think they're pretty, I don't know. But maybe when you think of someone who is maybe has a big ego, maybe you think of someone like Muhammad Ali, he's like overconfident in himself. He's always say, I am the greatest. Or maybe you think of someone like Donald Trump, who has to put his name on every building that he makes. And maybe you think though of maybe someone you know personally. Maybe you've had like a boss that you work for, and he always takes the credit at your job, even though he doesn't really do any of the work, or he doesn't listen to any of the employees, and things kind of fall apart because he doesn't listen. Or maybe you have someone in your family who just makes everything all about them and their problems, and it just kind of makes a mess of everything because it's always all about them. I know, like for me, there's this person that I run into at a place I go to. I frequent this place, occasionally, and whenever I go in there, this person is always open to talking because they love to talk. They love to talk about themselves, and they are always talking about themselves. And even if they ask you a question and you respond, the conversation quickly turns back to them and maybe their response to what question they were actually asking a question so they could talk about something they wanted to talk about. I don't know. It's just whenever I go in there and talk to this person, it always just feels like off-putting to me. But I think that they don't even realize that they're doing it, and it's just the conversation always turns about them, and they don't even realize what they're doing. And as we're talking about humility today, we're talking about our choices. Like we've been talking about other things like money, and next week we're talking about parenting, and then we're going to be talking about like marriage, dating stuff. Like that stuff is like really practical. But as we're talking about humility today, it really plays a big factor into our choices. One of the things we've been talking about is we want to make wise choices because it shapes our life and our relationships, and humility plays into that a lot. Because if we're proud, it can have a negative effect on our life and relationships. But if we approach life with humility, it can have the opposite effect. And we're going to see that today as we look at some of these verses. We've been looking in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is part of the wisdom literature of the Bible and has a lot of great insight. And one thing I always want to encourage you to do is follow us in the YouVersion Bible app. There'll be some details on the screen, hopefully, for that. And there they are. And then you can see there's a place you can follow us along in the Bible app. There's things you might follow along today, some guides for that. But I want to encourage you, if you haven't yet, to follow us in there. But also there's a Bible reading plan through the book of Proverbs. We've been doing that since the beginning of the year. And I know a bunch of you are doing that. And I've been doing that too. And so I want to encourage you to do that because it has so much wisdom in it it's practical advice for our life that we can make the most of the choices we make in this new year. So I want to really encourage you to maybe dial into that beyond just Sundays and to look into His Word throughout the week to gain this wisdom because it has such a big effect on our life. And so again, we're talking about money and parenting and relationships like that, but humility really has a significant part in the decisions we make. Here's what it says in Proverbs 22. It says, humility is the fear of the Lord. Its wages are riches and honor and life. Now, we've been talking about the fear of the Lord. It's a term we see in Proverbs a lot. And it's not something like Halloween, I'm scared, fear. It's not like that. It's fear in the sense of awe and reverence, of us saying, like, the fear of the Lord would be saying, God, I need you. I'm looking to you. I don't always know what's best. I'm trusting in you. We looked at another verse in Proverbs in the first week. It talked about the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Like, if we want to have wisdom, it begins with looking to God for his wisdom, his insight. He's the creator of it all. He's the designer of life. And so we look to him to guide us. We looked at this other verse in Proverbs 3. It says, if we trust in the Lord with all of our heart and lean not on our own understanding, not think we always know what's best, but if we look to him and trust in him, he'll make our paths straight. And that's what we want. We want to be on the right road. And so this is the fear of the Lord. And it talks about humility is a part of that. And if we're willing to walk humbly with our God, as the Bible says, then it says its wages, what it pays out, the benefits of it is riches and honor and life. When it says riches, that's blessings. In a sense, it might be financial blessings, because if we make wise choices with our money, there's some financial benefits to that, but there's blessings in so many other ways, and riches in so many other ways. It talks about honor, which is really talking about our relationships. There's this respect we have between people and our relationships. It brings honor in that. So making wise choices, walking humbly, affects our relationships. And then when it talks about life, it kind of goes back to that verse we just talked about, how God, when we look to his ways and walk humbly with him, it keeps us on the right path. We see something similar in Proverbs 15. It says this, the fear of the Lord teaches a man wisdom, and humility comes before honor. So this is what we want. We want wisdom, and it comes with looking to God, fear of him, and then walking humbly through this life. Now, when we think of humility, I don't know if you, like, what you even think of when you think of that. Like if you think of a person who's humble, if you think of, like, how would you define humility? Like, I don't even know what you might say. And I know I looked at the actual definition of the word humility, and it means to make yourself low. To make yourself low. And I looked at the definition of pride, and the definition of pride talked about this feeling of respect for yourself and your achievements, and the feeling of deserving to be respected by others. And it's interesting when you think about that, like, to make yourself low, that doesn't sound that good. But to have self-respect and have people respect you, that seems like a good thing, right? Like, are we sure we want to go in this way? Like, what is this really all about? Well, if we're talking about pride in the sense of not just respect for ourselves, but the pride in the sense of it takes another turn. It comes with this idea of thinking you're better than other people, and that's where the problem comes in. See, like, some people would say, what's the big deal with that? Like, be self-confident. Don't let people walk all over you. Like, if you are humble, you make yourself low, that just means you're weak. Some people would say that. Probably those muscle guys in the gym, like we were in the video earlier, would probably say something like that. Don't let people walk all over you. Look out for number one. If you are humble, people are just going to take advantage of you. That's weak. But that's not what we saw in the book of Proverbs. We saw the exact opposite in those verses we just looked at, that really there's so much wisdom in being wise. So much wisdom in humility, how it shapes our life and our relationships. So we want to be wise. And we saw in Proverbs that it talked about that. And what's interesting is I looked at a bunch of psychology reports and about humility and pride and the effects of that. And really we see the same thing in the reports. When I looked at some of the stuff that talked about, like, your ego, like, when we think of the word ego, that was made popular by Sigmund Freud with his personality theory back in 1920s. And so maybe you studied some of that in school. And when we think of ego, like, we think maybe of him, but even before he was around, the term was around. And it's actually a Latin term which means I. And the problem when we have a big ego is that our I gets a little too big and we think a little bit too much of ourselves. And so when I was looking at some of these reports, it talked about some of the things that hinder our life when we live like that. It said the effects of pride were it alienated relationships. Again, maybe you've been somewhere around that. I was talking about that person that I had conversations with. It kind of kept me at a distance because it's always about them, so it can alienate relationships. It can lead to a lack of self-awareness or reality, because when we look at ourselves as better, we see a filter of life through our own eyes, not through the eyes of other people, and it's always about like this world revolves around us. It talked about it could lead to things like racism and maybe judging other people in that sense. It can lead to isolation and loneliness because we've alienated relationships. And one of the interesting things, there was a lot of reports that talked about when we have a big ego, it often leads to a poor sense of self-worth. Like kind of the opposite of what we think. We think like, oh, those big muscle guys in the gym, big ego. Or someone who has a big ego, we think a lot of confidence. But what a lot of these reports I looked at in psychology, they talked about how oftentimes the self-worth is built into our achievements and our accomplishments. And they used this example. It talked about how someone might say, I'm really proud of the fact that I graduated from college. And that seems like a good thing to be proud of, right? But the problem is that if we continue on this path, our identity and our worth is all based on our achievements. And it's one thing when you graduate college, yes, it's good to be, have a healthy self-respect. It's good to be proud of our achievements. But when our worth is built in those, we have to keep achieving to make ourselves feel good. All of a sudden, our life is built around our achievements and our self-worth. When we can't always take those next big steps, it goes down the drain. We see this same kind of concept throughout the scriptures. Proverbs 11, verse 2, it says this: when pride comes, then comes disgrace. But with humility comes wisdom. Pride leads us down this path where it disgraces ourselves, where it hinders our relationships, it brings disgrace in that sense. But humility brings wisdom. Proverbs 16:5 says, the Lord detests all the proud of heart. Be sure of this, they won't go unpunished. That maybe the proud people who have this big ego, maybe they seem to be always getting ahead, but God says, that's not going to be the case. They won't go unpunished. Proverbs 16:18, a few verses later, says this: pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Like pride leads to our life falling apart. Proverbs 29:23 says, a man's pride brings him low, but a man of lowly spirit, a humble man, gains honor. What we see throughout the Bible is that God's kingdom is kind of like a kingdom flipped upside down. It's always like the exact opposite of maybe what our natural response might be. A man's pride, if someone thinks they're big stuff, it actually brings their life low. But when we consider ourselves one of lowly spirit, it can actually build our life up. It's the exact opposite. And maybe we've seen the effects of pride and the benefits of humility, and as we kind of look through the news and look around our world, we see people like politicians who let their pride get the best of them. They think they're kind of above all the rules, and they embezzle money, and eventually it catches up with them in their whole life, and things fall apart. Or you see maybe a celebrity of some sort. They can never seem to hold a relationship. They're kind of burning through those, maybe multiple divorces, because the life is all about them and their celebrity status, and everything revolves around them, and it blows up their relationships. It all falls apart. Maybe you've seen this with professional athletes, maybe like people who find all their worth in achievements, and then they get injured, and they just don't know how to handle that. Or like I know the sad part is we've even seen this in church world, where you see like a pastor who makes it all about him, and he has no accountability and makes some bad moral choices because there's no guardrails around him, and blows up his life and a lot of times his church. And maybe you've seen this in other people too. But I'm guessing for all of us here, we're probably not someone with this big ego. Like, what's the big deal? Like, I'm not like that. I don't think the world revolves all around me. It's not all about me. We're probably not in that boat. But I'm guessing there's still an issue with pride with all of us. See, pride can kind of sneak in the corners of our lives. And while none of those people, those that we just talked about, whose life got blown up, it wasn't just one choice that blew up their life. It was a series of steps that maybe began with a little pride that got them off track instead of following in the ways of God, walking humbly on the right path. And as we take those steps one by one, little by little, we get off track, and it ends up being a big deal down the road. Is pride sneaking in the corners of your life and your relationships? I know this happened to me. I remember this moment when I was in high school. I've shared this before, but it was kind of like something I'll never forget. We were hanging out with some friends, and it was some friends from my youth group at my church where I was at growing up. And I had this friend, Melissa. She was part of the group. And we were all hanging out, a bunch of us. And I said something funny, and everyone laughed, everyone but Melissa. And Melissa turns to me and very sternly and very bluntly says, "Matt, why do you always make fun of people just to make yourself feel good?" I was like, what? It was like a slap across the face. And that wasn't my motive. I was a little bit like probably that person that I was talking to earlier, where I didn't realize how my pride was setting in and affecting my life and relationships. That wasn't my motive. I wasn't doing that. But I was, like a high school guy. I mean, let alone guys, we're not sensitive, right? I mean, and then you throw a high school guy who's trying to figure out how life works. Your brain isn't fully developed. You can't judge things. I was just being funny, just for the sake of being funny. But there probably was a little bit of truth to that. And I'll never forget that comment. And so that's something I try to be aware of, something I still have to work on, is being sensitive and trying to take those steps to not let my pride get the best of me, to not let my ego get too big. Do you see pride sneaking in the corners of your life? Maybe it's in your thoughts, where you're making judgments of other people without really knowing them. Maybe it's thinking you're a little bit better than the other people you work with. Maybe it's those little bits of racism that sink in, where you judge someone else or make assumptions of someone based upon the color of their skin. Maybe it's just the way you end up treating people. I always say this: everyone, when they're growing up, should work in a fast food restaurant or as a server in a restaurant, because it teaches you how to respect other people. If you've worked in a restaurant, you know what I'm talking about. You get mistreated, and maybe you see that. Maybe you're the one that kind of blows up on the waiter or waitress when things don't go quite right. And if you're in the food business, it's not always your fault as a server. There's lots of other issues, but maybe they're just having a bad day. But do you treat other people with a lack of respect just because you think you didn't get the service that you deserve? And that's pride sneaking in the corners. Pride sneaking in. Do you see that happening in your life? I was listening to this leadership podcast. We actually did this for our staff. There's this author, John Acuff, and we were listening to his podcast, and he was talking about leadership, and he said, as a leader, are you making choices that are good for your leadership, or choices that just make you feel good? And I thought that was really interesting. And I wonder if that really applies to humility and our pride. Maybe the question is a little bit different of, are you making choices that build up your life and relationship? Are you making the wise choice? Or are you just making choices to build up your ego? It's an interesting question to consider. It's probably a little bit of both in our world. It's that pride sneaking in those corners. Are you making decisions just to build up your ego, to make yourself feel good, to do what you just want to do? Or are you going to make wise choices out of humility that build up your life and your relationships? One of the interesting things as I was looking through the psychological studies was there's one theory that came up. It's from Dr. Schoen, and it's the ontological addiction theory, and it's really like a paradox. And he was talking about someone can appear to be very egocentrical, like a big ego, but actually on the inside, there's an inferiority complex. On the inside, they don't feel good about themselves. They feel like they're not good enough. There's this inferior side, and how that displays out in their choices, in their relationships, is this big ego, because they're trying to protect themselves on the inside or not let anyone see all the hurt on the inside. It's kind of like a paradox. It's all of this self-consciousness. That really kind of goes back to what we talked about last week when we talked about contentment as part of the ways to deal with our money. We said, hey, maybe you're like that guy who lives in Michigan. You got to have the truck that's really expensive and big. You got to have the snowmobile, the boat, all those type of things, because that's what guys in Michigan do. Now, there's nothing wrong with having the boat and the big truck and stuff like that. But if you're getting those things just because you're falling into this pressure to impress other people or to live up to a status, We said that's where the problem comes in. We got to be content. That leads to bad choices with our money. And that really plays into what we were just talking about with our ego and the self-consciousness. If we're self-conscious, then we can end up making decisions and choices just to build up ourselves and our ego. And that has all those negative effects of pride, alienating relationships, letting our life fall apart, as it said in Proverbs, leading ourselves towards isolation. Don't let your ego get in the way. See, humility isn't about letting people just walk all over you. Humility isn't even thinking of yourself as lower than other people. When it says making yourself low, what it's really talking about is not thinking of yourself too highly. In fact, the Bible says that. Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. And we see this even in what Jesus says is the greatest commandments. The greatest commandment, they asked Jesus, and he said, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. It's that fear of the Lord. And he said the second is to love your neighbor. And what does it say after that? It says, love your neighbor as yourself. Not thinking that you're lower than your neighbor or higher than your neighbor. It's keeping yourself in proper position where we respect each other on an equal plane, where we're not making judgments of other people based upon the color of their skin. We're not making judgments of other people because we think we're better. It's keeping everyone on the same plane and understanding, just like we have issues, other people have issues, like we have bad days, other people have bad days. Like, understand that we're all in this life and it's all a struggle, and not judging other people, but keeping this space to know that I know I have issues just like they do. Maybe they're just having a bad day like I had a bad day. It's this healthy respect for ourselves and others. It's not having a poor self-esteem. It's not having a poor self-worth. It's just not considering yourself better than other people. That's humility. And that really plays into our choices, and that really shapes our life and our relationships. And if we're going to take that a step further, interesting thing is I was listening to this message that another pastor gave. His name is Mark Batterson. And he was talking about this, and he talked about how we can end up making decisions based upon our ego. And when we look to protect our ego actually becomes more fragile. And it keeps people at a distance, and it can even keep God at a distance. And he was talking about how self-consciousness, when we feel self-conscious about ourselves, he was talking about how he felt that was part of like the curse that was passed down in the Garden of Eden. The Bible begins with God creating the heavens and the earth and creating everything, including man, Adam and Eve, and he would walk through the garden with Adam and Eve, and there was no self-consciousness with them. And then the serpent comes and he tempts them, and what does he say to them? He says, eat this fruit. They said, well, God told us not to eat of this fruit. Oh, but if you eat it, your eyes will be open and you'll be like God, feeding into the ego. Hey, you can be someone bigger and better, feeding into their ego. And they take the fruit, and what is their response? Self-consciousness sets in. Their first thing they do is they cover themselves and they hide from God, alienating their relationship. And what does that lead to? Shame and blaming the other person to try to cover their tracks. And we see that self-consciousness turns into a thing that hinders their relationships with God and each other, because that's what pride does. And he talked about an interesting thing too. There's another verse in Ephesians chapter 5:18, and it says this, don't be drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. And he was talking about how alcohol is really under this idea of lessening our self-consciousness, right? When we drink, if you get drunk, that means you're a little less self-conscious. You might be a little more outgoing. You might be a little more free of spirit, or just not even worried about those same things, because it's this kind of losing yourself, getting rid of the self-consciousness. And he said that's a poor replacement for what the Garden of Eden was designed to be, this relationship with God. But it says, don't be filled with wine, which is a poor substitute that doesn't last, causes you to not make good decisions. He says, instead be filled with God's Spirit. This is another sense of less self-consciousness. See, being filled with his Spirit makes us not be concerned so much about our own selves, but more concerned about God. When we take steps to be, as he would say, be more God-conscious, to be filled with his Spirit, what he was saying is it allows us to see ourselves and to see other people through the eyes of God. We realize our self-worth isn't based upon our performance and our achievements or what other people think about us. We begin to see ourselves as someone different, to see ourselves as God sees us, someone he loves, someone he sees as incredibly valued. He sees you with value so much so that he sent his son to give up his life for you. To see yourself as a child of God, someone who wants to be part of his family. To see yourself as someone who is cherished. To see this God who cares about every aspect of your life. See, when we begin to see our worth and our value through his eyes, this brings humility to our life. And it also shapes how we see other people, because we realize not only am I a child of God, but they have the opportunity to be a child of God as well. We need to see them as God sees them, someone who has value and worth and is loved. It shapes things differently. We need to be less self-conscious, and we can only do that when we are more God-conscious, to let him shape how we see ourselves and how we see other people. This brings us back kind of to where we began today. Look at these Proverbs with me again. Proverbs 15:33 says, "The fear of the Lord teaches a man wisdom, and humility comes before honor." Honor is this thing where we find value in ourselves, where people see something different in us, where it benefits our relationships. That only comes when we walk humbly with our God, when we become more God-conscious. Proverbs 22:4 says, "Humility is the fear of the Lord," to see ourselves through his eyes, to see others through his eyes, humble, not seeing ourselves better than other people, but on an even plane with everyone. And if we're willing to walk like that, its benefits, its wages, are riches and blessings of so many kinds. Its benefit brings life to us to guide us on the right path. Its benefit is honor again in those relationships. So let me ask you again. The choices you're making, are you choosing to do things based upon your ego, to build up your ego? Or are you making wise choices to build up your life and your relationships? You see maybe pride sneaking in the corner of your lives, where how you make judgments upon other people. Maybe today's a day just to examine our own hearts and to let the humility settle in, to maybe rid ourselves of those prejudices, judgments of other people. Maybe ask God to change how we see ourselves and others. Let's be more God-conscious. Maybe just take a minute with me. Maybe close your eyes. Let's just reflect upon this, to take a minute to examine your own heart. In this moment, we need to ask God to shift how you see yourself, to shift how you see others, to maybe get rid of those, to confess those maybe prejudices that you have, or to confess your pride, to ask him to build humility in your life. However you want to respond, let's just take a moment just to examine our own hearts. God, we thank you so much that you are a God who cares about each and every one of us. That you are a God who loves us, who calls us his own. That you are a God who values us, cares about everything in our life. May we just get a better sense of that today, God, to find our worth and how you see us. But may that also shift how we see others. May we be filled with your Spirit, God. May you shift our hearts and convict our hearts of any of this pride that may have set in. May we just see ourselves and others differently with humility. May we walk humbly with you, God. May we reap those benefits. May you bring the wages of riches and honor and life into us this new year. We continue to look to you, God. Pray in your name. Amen.